Before we dive into one of the darkest chapters in American history, make sure you're locked in with us. Hit subscribe, tap like, and drop a comment below, because stories like this one will haunt you long after the screen goes dark. It was March of 1944, in the small mill town of Alkaloo, South Carolina. A place so tiny it was little more than a railroad, a lumber mill, and a scattering of weathered homes divided down invisible lines of race and poverty. On one side of the tracks, white families lived in modest but respectable houses, their children playing under the oak trees and running to the general store. On the other side, black families, mostly mill workers, lived in worn cabins, struggling to make ends meet while enduring the suffocating grip of Jim Crow segregation. That spring afternoon, two young white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, were last seen pedaling their bicycles down a dirt road. They were headed toward the black side of town, looking for wildflowers, their laughter echoing into the pines. By evening, when they failed to return home, panic set in. Parents called neighbors, neighbors called sheriffs, and soon search parties with lanterns combed through the fields. By the next morning, the laughter was gone. The girls were found in a ditch, their bicycles twisted beside them, their bodies bruised, beaten, lifeless. In a town like Alkaloo, news traveled faster than fire. Whispers became accusations before facts could catch up. And in 1944 South Carolina, accusations carried more weight than truth, especially when the accused was young, black, and defenseless. George Stinney Jr. was just 14 years old. Barely over 5 feet tall and weighing less than 95 pounds, he was known to friends and neighbors as quiet, lanky, with a smile too shy for his age. His father worked at the mill, but on the morning after the discovery, deputies stormed into the Stinney home. George and his brother had been seen talking briefly with Betty June and Mary Emma as they passed by the yard the day before. To the deputies, that was enough. No lawyer, no guardian, no protection. George was taken into custody, shoved into a car, and driven away. His parents were left behind, powerless, frightened, and already sensing the storm about to consume their son. At the station, interrogation turned to intimidation. For hours, George sat alone with deputies, their questions sharp, their tones accusatory. There was no transcript, no recording, no lawyer, just a boy, trembling, cornered, and overwhelmed by men in uniforms who insisted he was guilty. Later, deputies claimed George had confessed, but no written statement was ever produced. It was a word against silence, and in 1944, his silence never stood a chance. By sundown, word spread like wildfire. A black boy had been arrested for killing 2 white girls. In a town already carved by racial hostility, the air turned thick with anger and vengeance. Crowds gathered. Voices rose. And beneath it all, a community already knew the outcome before a trial date was even set. George's family, fearing for their lives, fled town under threats from white mobs. They left behind everything they owned, terrified of what would happen if they stayed. George, meanwhile, was left alone in a jail cell, unable to comprehend the gravity of what was unfolding. He wasn't thinking about electric chairs or life sentences. He was a child. He thought about his parents. He thought about school. He thought about his dog, waiting back home. But justice in Alkaloo wasn't waiting for innocence or truth. It was waiting for a spectacle. The trial began just 1 month later. The courthouse was filled wall to wall with white townspeople, their eyes fixed on Timahai, a small, fragile boy in the defendant's chair. George sat so low that he needed a Bible stacked beneath him just to see over the table. His court-appointed lawyer, inexperienced and unprepared, called no witnesses. No defense was presented. The jurors never heard George speak a word in his own defense. The prosecution, meanwhile, leaned on the supposed confession, a confession that George himself would later deny. and the circumstantial testimony that the girls were last seen with him. That was all they needed. The entire trial lasted barely 2 hours. The jury, 12 white men, deliberated for just 10 minutes. When they returned, the verdict was guilty. The judge didn't hesitate. George Stinney Jr., just 14 years old, was sentenced to die by electric chair. Outside the courthouse, the crowd roared with satisfaction. Inside the jail, George sat in stunned silence. He asked for his Bible. He asked when he could see his parents. He didn't fully grasp what execution meant, only that grown men were treating him as something less than human. His lawyer never filed an appeal. His family, driven away by mobs, couldn't return to help him. In the weeks that followed, the case became a grim countdown. Newspapers splashed George's face across their pages, not with sympathy, but with suspicion, as if his guilt was never in question. Priests visited, praying over him. Guards whispered about how small he looked in the cell, how childlike his hands were gripping the bars. Even some who believed in his guilt murmured uneasily at the thought of strapping a child into the chair. But the machinery of justice in 1944 South Carolina wasn't built for mercy. It was built for speed, for order, for control, and it was moving relentlessly toward the day that would forever stain its history. The morning of his execution drew closer. Guards kept their eyes on him as if watching for a monster. But what they saw was a boy, wide-eyed, trembling, too small for the prison uniform draped over him. He wrote a note to his family. He prayed, and he waited. Meanwhile, in the shadows of Alcaloo, people whispered. Some said the crime scene didn't add up, that George was too small, too weak, too young to have committed such a brutal killing. Others pointed to footprints and evidence ignored, or to the rushed nature of the trial. But whispers could not stop the tide. And then, just one day before the appointed date, a shocking discovery shook even those who thought the case was closed. In a field not far from where the girls were found, a deputy stumbled upon something hidden beneath a pile of leaves. A piece of evidence overlooked, or perhaps deliberately ignored. Something that suggested the story everyone had been told might not be the truth at all. The deputy crouched in the brush, pulling back the leaves with hesitant hands. What he found was not large, just a small rusted piece of iron, heavy, dented, and streaked with something that looked too dark to be rust. To the trained eye, it was a railroad spike hammer, the kind used daily in the mill town of Alcaloo. To the untrained, it was just another tool discarded in the dirt. But to anyone who had stood over the bodies of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, the shape of the dents told another story. The girls' injuries had always suggested something blunt, heavy, precise. But the hammer had never been presented in court, never logged as evidence. Instead, the narrative had been fixed. George Stinney Jr. had lured them into the woods and killed them. No weapon was shown. No explanation for how a frail 95-pound boy could overpower 2 girls. The hammer could have changed everything. Yet in 1944, it changed nothing. Deputies dismissed it, saying it was irrelevant. The discovery, quietly buried, never made it to the defense. The jury never saw it. George never knew it existed. And the clock kept ticking toward the day when the state of South Carolina would extinguish a child's life. In his jail cell, George grew quieter with each passing day. His Bible sat on the thin mattress, its pages folded where he had underlined the Psalms. Guards whispered about how he cried for his mother at night, though no family was allowed to visit. His father, too afraid of lynching mobs, stayed in hiding. His siblings scattered, their names whispered with suspicion through town. The isolation was unbearable. Yet even at 14, George tried to hold on to some sense of hope. He asked a guard once, "When will I get to go home?" The guard looked at him but didn't answer. He couldn't. Meanwhile, beyond the prison walls, the community sharpened its teeth. Newspapers fueled the frenzy, their headlines screaming of guilt, their stories dripping with assumptions. They painted George not as a boy, but as a monster in human skin. "Confessed murderer," they wrote, though no signed confession existed. To the readers, that was enough. To the mob, it was more than enough. Still, cracks began to show. Some townsfolk murmured that the trial had been too quick, too neat. 10 minutes of deliberation. Could justice really be served in the time it takes to boil water? Others whispered that George was being used, a scapegoat to calm the fury of a white community demanding retribution. Yet no one spoke loudly. In Alcolu, speaking out was as dangerous as silence. The date of execution was set, June 16, 1944, just 71 days after the crime. That morning, the prison corridors buzzed with a grim electricity. Journalists arrived, their notebooks ready, eager to witness the spectacle. Officials moved briskly, some avoiding eye contact, others steeling themselves with a cold professionalism. Deep down, many knew the weight of what they were about to do. But the machinery of the state had no brakes. George was led from his cell in shackles, the chains clinking against the stone floor. Witnesses later recalled how his small frame seemed to disappear inside the oversized prison uniform. His hands trembled, but he held his head high, a Bible clutched tightly against his chest. The electric chair loomed ahead, towering, mechanical, designed to subdue the strongest of men. But today, it would hold a child. The straps were too big for George. Guards scrambled to adjust them, leather creaking as they tightened around his thin wrists and legs. His feet barely reached the floor. He sat stiffly, terrified, but trying to be brave. The oversized mask slipped down his face, nearly covering his entire head. Witnesses described him as looking swallowed whole by the machine. The warden read the sentence aloud. A hush fell over the room. George's last words, barely audible, were, "I'm innocent. I never killed those girls." When the switch was pulled, the current surged. The chair rattled violently. George's small body jolted with such force that the mask fell off, exposing his tear-streaked face to everyone in the room. Gasps broke out. Some turned away, but the current kept flowing until his body slumped lifeless. In just 4 minutes, America had executed its youngest person in the 20th century. Outside the prison, the mob cheered. Justice, they believed, had been served. Inside, silence clung to the walls. Even those who believed in the verdict could not erase the image of a boy swallowed by leather straps and jolts of electricity. The case was closed. The file was sealed. George Stinney Jr. was dead, but death was not the end of the story. Over the decades, whispers became questions. Journalists, lawyers, and civil rights activists revisited the case, peeling back layers of lies and omissions. Why was there no written confession? Why was no defense mounted? Why was the trial rushed? Why was crucial evidence like the hammer never presented? The more they dug, the clearer it became. George Stinney had not been given a chance at justice. He had been given as much time as it took to satisfy the fury of a segregated town. Nothing more. And then, 70 years later, the truth clawed its way back into the light. In 2014, a South Carolina judge re-examined the case. Testimonies were heard, historical records scoured, and experts weighed in. The conclusion was chilling. George had been denied due process. He had been denied fairness. He had been denied justice. The conviction was vacated, 70 years too late. But with the truth came an even darker revelation. Because hidden in those dusty records, buried beneath decades of silence, was a name that had never been spoken aloud in court. A name of someone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or protected all those years ago. A name that suggested the real killer may have walked free, while a child paid the ultimate price. The wooden floor creaked beneath the weight of the prison guards as they escorted George Stinney Jr. through the cold, echoing halls of the South Carolina Penitentiary. At just 14 years old, the boy's thin frame seemed swallowed by the oversized prison uniform draped on his shoulders. His wrists, shackled in cold steel, were so small that the handcuffs nearly slipped off. Yet, for the state of South Carolina in 1944, this boy had become the monster that had terrorized Alcolu. Outside the prison walls, the town was divided. Some whispered that George was innocent, that the confession had been forced. Others clung to their prejudices, satisfied that justice was being done swiftly. But inside those chambers, the only thing George could hear was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, hammering like a drum of fate. He was just a child, yet he had been thrust into the cruel machinery of a system that was already set against him. The day of execution arrived. Reporters filled the small chamber, eager to witness what would become a grotesque milestone in American history. The electric chair, looming like a wooden beast, waited for its victim. George's legs trembled as guards attempted to strap him in, but the straps hung loose, designed for grown men, not for boys. One guard had to pile books beneath him just so the headpiece could fit properly. It was a chilling scene that burned itself into the memories of those who watched. Witnesses later recalled the look in George's eyes, wide, terrified, searching for someone to believe him, someone to save him. But no one came. His attorney had long since disappeared. The trial was over, and the jury's decision was final. The warden gave a nod. A guard pulled the switch. Sparks lit the chamber, and a hiss filled the air. Within moments, George Stinney Jr. became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. He was 14 years old. Decades later, George's story refused to die. Historians and civil rights advocates revisited the case, uncovering the gaping flaws in his trial. The lack of witnesses for his defense, the coerced confession, the jury composed entirely of white men in a racially segregated town. In 2014, 70 years after George's execution, a South Carolina judge officially vacated his conviction, ruling that he had not received a fair trial. It was far too late to save his life, but it restored his name and revealed the truth. The state had executed an innocent child. The haunting weight of George's case still lingers today. It serves as a grim reminder of how fear, prejudice, and haste can rob the innocent of justice. And while the verdict was overturned, the damage could never be undone. His story is not just about one boy. It is about every miscarriage of justice that has followed. George Stinney Jr.'s name is no longer whispered only in the shadows of Alcaloo. It echoes in classrooms, in documentaries, and in the hearts of those who fight for justice. He was not a monster. He was not a killer. He was a boy, caught in a storm of hatred and fear, sacrificed to a flawed system, and that, perhaps, is the most tragic crime of all. If you found this story powerful, subscribe for more haunting true crime cases that reveal the darkest corners of justice. Because sometimes, the scariest stories are the true ones.